Thanks. I'd be remiss if I didn't say a few words about the men and women of your armed forces. Because it may not seem like it to you, but we're at war, and your armed forces have been at war for 10 years. And we're at war with a global extremist network that attacked us on our soil, actually not far from here, and you all know that. And that same network has tried to attack us several more times just in the last year. And they're not going to quit. They're not going to give up. Some of the men and women of the armed forces that are here have fought them. They know what we're up against. And we believe that we're involved in a long-term ideological struggle against an extremist ideology. And we tend to think of this struggle more in terms of the Cold War than we do of a conventional campaign. And so we believe that after being at war for 9 years, we're probably looking at another decade. And we say that because we look at the fact that we're at war, and then we look at the trends that we see in the global environment. And those trends seem to us to be more likely to exacerbate the situation that we're facing than they do to ameliorate them. What am I talking about? Globalization. There's no question that globalization is bringing prosperity around the world, although it's a little sluggish these days. But even that prosperity is being very unevenly distributed. And you see the have and have-not countries, and the populations of these have-not countries are much more susceptible to recruiting by the extremist organizations. Technology. Technology is another double-edged sword. The same technology that's bringing knowledge to anyone with a computer is being used by terrorists to export terror. Demographics. Another trend pushing us in the wrong direction. We have studies that say that the populations of some developing countries could double in the next decade. Can you imagine the population of Pakistan doubling in the next decade and all the problems that would bring to an already strapped government? The population in the world is also increasingly moving towards cities. We have studies that say that by 2030, 60% of the population of the world will live in cities. And some of the soldiers and Marines here I know have fought in a place called Sadr City, a place in Iraq that's 3 miles by 5 miles square. 2 million people live there. Tough place to operate. The other thing about demographics is the increased pressure it's going to put on resources. The middle classes in China and India are already larger than the population of the United States. That's a lot of two-car families and a lot of demand for resources. And the two trends that worry me most, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorist organizations and safe havens. Countries or parts of countries where the local governments can't or won't deny them to terrorist organizations, much like Afghanistan before September 11th or Yemen today. And so you put all those trends together against the fact we're already at war, and we believe we're in for a decade or so of what I call persistent conflict. Protracted confrontation among states, non-states, and individual actors who are increasingly willing to use violence to accomplish their political and ideological objectives. I believe that's the reality that we're going to face. And against that background, we have an armed forces that while it is hugely resilient, professional, and combat seasoned, it's carried a heavy load. Just within the Army, since 2001, we've lost over 4,000 soldiers, and they've left over 20,000 family members. We've had over 28,000 soldiers wounded, 7,500 of them seriously enough to require long-term care. We've had over 100,000 soldiers since 2000 diagnosed with mild traumatic brain injury. Now, fortunately, 90% of those are mild or moderate, and the soldiers recover and get on. We've had more than 50,000 soldiers diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. The long-term impacts of this war are going to be with us for a while, even as we continue to fight it for another decade or so. And our soldiers have been deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan 1 year deployed, 1 year home. And that's put a huge burden on our soldiers and their families. Fortunately, we've been working hard to mitigate some of the impacts of this, and the fact we're drawing down to 50,000 in Iraq, or have drawn down to 50,000 in Iraq, and we've completed our growing the Army by 100,000 soldiers since 2007. We will get to the point by this time next year where soldiers will deploy having 2 years home between the deployments. But I will tell you that we could not have sustained that and can't continue to sustain it for another decade or so without the support of organizations like this. Because when you give to help the children of the fallen, you are sending a message to every serviceman and woman that America cares. And please don't underestimate the impact that that has had on our ability to sustain this long-term commitment. So thank you for what you do.